Professor of English at Ashoka University, and he's interested in early modern understandings of globalization and the foreign, and how these have helped shape our knowledge and experiences of bodies, disease, commerce, time, and religious differences. His latest books include Shakespeare and Literary Theory and Marvelous Repositions with a subtitle, The Tempest, Globalization, and The Waking Dream of Paradise. He's also the editor of Indography, Writing the Indian in Early Modern England. His new book, The First Firangis, that was the title of our talk also, The First Firangis, How to Be Authentically Indian, will be published. Over to you.
Thank you, Riz. It's interesting to have this talk framed as a magnetic meeting of opposites, which may be true, but I'd like to just unsettle that a bit by signaling a profound debt on my part to our speaker tonight. If it wasn't for a collection, an anthology that he put together, which some of you may have encountered. It's in India. It's called Across the Three Seas, Traveller's Tales from Mughal India. It's an absolutely fabulous collection of writings from the 16th and 17th century by Europeans who travelled to India before the age of the British Raj. And in that collection, I encountered for the first time Niccolo Manucci's account of being accosted by two bandits just outside of Agra en route to Delhi. Bandits who at first glance might seem to be Indian, but turned out to be a pair of disreputable Englishmen who had gone native in India. If it wasn't for this aleatory encounter, and I'm speaking here not about Manucci's with the bandits, but mine with Michael's work, I probably wouldn't be doing what I'm doing, and I may not even be doing what I'm doing where I'm doing it, here. So, Michael, I've got to start off by thanking you for creating the conditions in which I could be here in the first place to introduce you now.
I should probably ask your forgiveness then.
That anthology is just one of many astonishing pieces of work from a large corpus of publication. Michael has written, co-written, or edited no less than 10 books, some of them very, very influential. And throughout his writing, he has been fascinated generally by migration, and more specifically by the interactions between people from India and Britain in an age of British imperial expansion. What's particularly interesting, and I'd say unusual, about Michael's work is that he is interested in the experience of migration in two ways. He's written very powerfully about the British in India, including in the collection that I've told you about, but also in a book called, is it Counterflows to Colonialism? It was published by Oxford University Press in 1994 about migrants to Britain from India. Many of you will be familiar with his book about the politics of the annexation of India by Britain. And he has also published fairly recently an extraordinary book called The Inordinately Strange Life of Dice Sombre, about the first person of Indian descent to be elected to the British Parliament. This was in the 19th century. He only lasted about 9 months in Parliament before he was rolled for corruption. I'm not going to make a remark about that initiating a glorious tradition of Indian politicians. But Dice Sombre's life is an extraordinary life. And Michael's delicate and elegant and fascinating account of not only a political life, the life of someone who was the result of miscegenation, but also the life of someone who, from all accounts, seems to have gone mad. It's a fascinating account of the intersection between the personal, the historical, and the political. So Michael H. Fisher is Robert S. Danforth Professor of History at Oberlin College in the US. He's been teaching there for a number of years. He was, before that, at West Washington University, and prior to that, he did his PhD at the University of Chicago. So he's moved around quite a bit in America, and he has moved often to India. He was here in 2007 and had a brief fellowship at Delhi University, and this year he is affiliated with the history program at JNU. So just like the people Michael writes about, he himself knows quite a bit about migration personally. So we're looking forward tonight to his talk on extending Indian history into Britain. Michael, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for coming. We're talking about the movements of people, and what I'd like to do is talk about the way that we can discuss these movements of people across half the world, but more from an Indian perspective than from a British perspective at this particular point. So if the earliest Indian settlers in Britain are there from about 1600, we tend to think about 1600, Queen Elizabeth I, the founding of the East India Company, from a British perspective. And then, of course, 1857, we also think of that as a point at which the East India Company ended. There was the rising in India. And so it's often put in terms of British colonialism in India. What I'd like to do is displace that and talk about Indians going to Britain. That is, do this time period from the perspective of those first people who made this journey. And in so doing, I hope to extend the history of India, the world of India, into Britain as a complement to the way that so much history has been the extension of British history and imposed on India. So trying to do it from that perspective. In order to set the context, we have to remember that Europeans came to India before the Mughal Empire began, and certainly were instrumental in the decline and fragmentation of the Mughal Empire. Also, this period is one in which the ways that colonialism came to India really affected things. So in order to try to make history dynamic, what I'd like to do is start with the expansion of the Mughal Empire and then its fragmentation, keeping in mind that history is not fixed. And when you think of the Mughal Empire, it's not a particular place, but it's a dynamic process. So we can see, looking at the time, 1526, Babur enters, Humayun is pushed out, they return, reestablish the empire. Akbar then, of course, begins to expand fairly rapidly, but you have rebellion and resistance that has to be overcome. And then over time, you have Jahangir, who consolidates parts of the empire, tries to expand in some places. We have Shah Jahan, of course, who expands as well. And then Aurangzeb begins to move south, even off of this map. And you get a sense that the empire is a constantly changing place. It's constantly moving. It's not a fixed entity. And then it begins to fragment. Pieces break off, pieces fall away. And over time, what you end up with is the empire in name, but not necessarily in place. And just to finish off this map, what you'll notice is that over from about 1803 onward, the empire is only in Delhi, and there will be one red pixel at the end, which of course, what does the red pixel represent? The emperor in the Red Fort in Delhi. So what you're talking about is a process of change, and we have to keep that change in mind. The other element that we want to keep in mind is that colonialism was a process as well. And so looking at history as a dynamic process, we know that the Portuguese came around Africa 1497 and established a route for transportation, for communication, that had never been there before. Certainly Asians have been moving around in the Indian Ocean, but the idea of going around Africa rather than having to go through overland Europe to get to the west, not that you'd want to go to Europe in the 15th century if you were Indian, there wasn't much there, but the new creation of a route by the Portuguese, and then certainly far more by the English East India Company, founded in 1600 with a base at Surat, a base in Madras, and then of course Surat is replaced by Bombay, and then we get Calcutta founded, and then following the English East India Company, you have other East India companies, Dutch, Danish, French, and so on. So that we find then new routes being created, but also new political conditions within India. And just looking at the English East India Company, over time, we're talking about the red areas under British direct rule as of 1797, as of 1840, as of 1857. So again, thinking of the British expansion as a dynamic process. But going back to this map, once this route is established, with European ships for the most part going back and forth, it's used by Indians. And in fact, the first English ships that come to India have Indian sailors aboard who would come to Portugal, then on to England. And the debate in London was, could they take their English wives with them aboard ship? And when the East India Company decided, no, that would be not so good to have 3 English women aboard a ship full of sailors for 6 months, could they take their pay and give it to their English wives until they returned? So we're talking that Indians are coming to India from England at the same time that the first English people are coming to India from England. So this process is not first Europeans come out and then Indians, but it's always been a dynamic process. And what I've tried to do is describe this as a counterflow, as Indians are going first around the Cape of Good Hope, and then of course later, after the Suez Canal is established, more going up the Red Sea and through the Suez Canal. So this movement of people, it's a counterflow in the sense that the numbers were never as much as the Europeans coming out. The power certainly was never much in their hands. They're going on European ships, usually with European sponsors, but they are going. So this coined term of a counterflow is supposed to suggest not the dynamic flow, but nonetheless a movement back in the other direction. And further, a whole range of different people went. So if we just organize them by class, we know the British are always interested in class, so we can talk about it in those terms. You have people of almost every class. You have seamen, you have servants, wives and children of Europeans, scholars, diplomats, officials, entrepreneurs, tourists, engineers, medical students. And so a whole range of people are coming. It's a little hard to quantify them because, as we'll see, the issue of who is Indian, who is not Indian, even if you're coming from India, it doesn't mean you're necessarily Indian, means that we have to just have a broad range of 20 to 40,000 people that I can document by 1857 have made the journey to England. Most of them have come back, but some stay on. And so we're talking about a movement of a substantial number of people, not nearly as many as Europeans going out, but still a substantial number of people. And we can begin to look at these people in terms of not just travel narratives written by Britons about India, about Indians. A Briton sees an Indian aboard ship or as a servant writes about it, but also texts by Indians about themselves. And you find over this period of time no less than 21 different book-length manuscripts, some published, some remaining in manuscript, written by Indians about their journeys to the West. Now this is only 21 out of the 40,000 perhaps who went. Everybody would bring back oral traditions. And so what you will tell your family about tonight's talk may be exaggerated, but it's an account. And if you wrote it, as some journalist might, it might be slightly different from an oral account. So every one of the 40,000 had an oral account, explained what it was to be in Britain at this time. And of those, only a small percentage, but still giving us a sizable body of source material, actually wrote about it. In addition to these full-length manuscripts, there are also letters, petitions by the hundreds. And if you go through the archives of the East India Company, of course, it's a company, so it keeps lots of records. There are hundreds of accounts in which people autobiographically describe themselves, say why they came, what they were looking for, some way what their experiences were, and so on. And so we can go through the source material and look at some of these people. And I'd like to just give you a taste of most of them, because it's clearly, you can't talk about 40,000 in a short time, but also focus on one, who's in fact my wife's favorite person, immigrant, and so we can talk about him. Just looking at seamen, you find quite a number of sailors who come. Sailors tend not to write about themselves. They tend to be marginal to society, living in their own section of town, coming out, sort of arriving, usually in the fall when the ships arrive from India, and then in the spring they would go home. So they spend 3 or 4 months in England over the winter, and if you've done that, you know that they don't have a lot of positive things to say about the weather in England or life there. But nonetheless, there was a community, and if you look at artwork, this is commemorating the creation of the new East India Company headquarters. In the side, if you're looking carefully, who do you see? You see an Indian, probably a sailor, either asking or giving information to a European. So we begin to see in some art Indians caught up in this. But we also find some Indians who actually write about it. Now, the question is, who is Indian? Joseph Amin was actually born in Iran, of Armenian Christian parents. They were driven out by the disruptions in Iran, and they came, so he went through his youth in Calcutta. So how long do you have to live in Calcutta to be Indian? He spoke Persian, that's helpful. His family was a merchant. He ran away as a young man and shipped aboard a vessel going to England. So he's clearly not of the class of sailors, but because he's not of the class of sailors, he wrote about his experiences. And if you look at his account, The Life and Adventures of Joseph Amin, an Armenian, which he actually published in London in 1792, one of the early published autobiographies in all of Europe, but he wrote it after he had returned to India and settled there and retired there. So it's mostly about his life in India, although it was published in London where the printing was less expensive and more available. And it was also something that he was able to maybe design for a European audience in English. But an autobiography, and a section of it talks about life aboard ship, how the other sailors treated him, what foods they ate, and so on. So this is one, if you will, taste of the kinds of accounts we can get. You also get images like this from Bristol in the 1840s of local characters. So Indian sailors as part of the scenery in Bristol. Many were in London, but also other ports. And perhaps presenting a petition, but they're just around in society. And so we can get a sense of this body of Indian men, all sailors were men, in England, in various ports, in London, in the East End of London. And they're a presence all the way through this period, and they're certainly the largest number of people who go. Another way that they lived was as a crossing sweeper. Okay, this is a little British history. In the 1840s, everything's drawn by horses. I don't have to tell you what horses do periodically. So the streets are filled with dung. During the years after the Napoleonic Wars, most crossing sweepers who would sweep aside the dung in exchange for a tip from ladies with long dresses or men with spats were disabled English soldiers. But if they died out, that niche began to be filled by Indian sailors who had left their ships and got an occupation. It's not a pleasant occupation, but if you got a good crossing, you could actually do quite well. And so that some Indians became able to save enough money to become innkeepers for other Indian sailors into the lower middle classes by working their way out of this means of access into English society. So we can see then some of these ways that Indian sailors, working class people, fit in. There were also quite a number of servants. About half the servants, like more than half the servants, were women. The other half were men, who came to England, and they were not cheap labor. You had to post a bond before you could take a servant. You have to pay their passage. So this was a prestige thing. If you had an Indian servant in your household, this was a mark of status. And they were treated often with a great deal of, if not respect, at least visibility. So this first picture that you had seen is of an Indian who we know was in London, 1633. Anthony van Dyck, a very famous Anglo-English painter, doing large oils, charged a lot, so someone paid a lot of money for him to be painted. It's clearly a painting from life. This isn't a stereotype. This is a real person, and we can maybe try to analyze his clothing. He was from Western India. So we have this image of someone who was clearly there. And if we look at the painting as a whole, it was paid for by the Earl of Denbigh, who was actually the man in charge of the king's wardrobe. So we know good clothes. He was sent off as an ambassador. And this picture commemorates a time that he got lost. So he's in India, he was wandering around and he got lost. And this Indian set him straight and got him out of the jungle. So the painting, paid for by Denbigh, is of an Occidental man in the Orient who's disoriented, and then reoriented by an Oriental who he takes to the Occident with him. And we know from the records that this young man, we don't know his years, was there for about 2 or 3 years. He's clearly empowered by the picture. He's the one that's telling Denbigh something. And if you're paying for the painting and you have someone telling you something, clearly it's not, this is a menial of nothing to say. So he has some sort of position. He's a servant, attendant, much younger. But nonetheless, his experience of London would have been distinctive, and he certainly would have passed that on to his companions when he came home. We also have another painting, a number of these, I'm only being selective. Joshua Reynolds, another expensive painter, commissioned by Edward Cruttenden, is doing a picture of his children and their ayah. So she's central to the picture. She has enough prestige that she's not exactly a member of the family, but they're willing to give valuable space for her. And so there she is, and if we look at her, we know that her name was either Rebecca, Patty, or Sophia. That is, Indians were often given, as many servants are, the names that the British could pronounce. So we don't know what her original name was. But if you look at her, she's looking down, so she's modest, but she's towering over the children. She's not exactly wearing Indian clothing. It's not an exotic sari sort of thing. But if you look at her jewelry, how is this servant treated? I mean, we're talking about pearls, we're talking about gold. This is someone who either was loaned or owned fairly valuable jewelry, and she's a member of the family, included when Cruttenden has the picture painted by Joshua Reynolds. Another Reynolds a few years later, by a brother of Robert Clive, a man of George Clive, who also came back from India rich. And again, he has an Indian in the middle. We know her name was Bola. At least that's how it was written. We're not sure exactly what that means. But if you look at her, she's looking down again. But it's the child, really, that's wearing more Indian clothes. And she doesn't seem to be wearing particularly Indian clothes. But we're talking about ivory bracelets. We're talking about wedding collie, probably gold in her hair. So we're talking about someone in the family, a servant, but clearly not a menial servant. And so that there are a number of pictures like this of people who have come as servants and then in one way or another entered into society with perhaps some position. It wasn't necessarily always easy, but some position. Going on, we also have lots of wives and children. Most people from Britain who went to India were male. I don't have to tell you that men tend to be non-celibate when away from home. So they had wives, they had mistresses, and they had children, and often they came back. And we can begin to look at some of these lives of Indian women and their children, male and female children, who came back and what positions they held. The earliest I've been able to document, I'm afraid there's no image of her, is Mariam. She was the daughter of Mubarak Khan, who was actually a Mansabdar, a fairly high official under Akbar, Emperor Akbar. He was an Armenian Christian who had come to the Mughal court and gotten the position. And she then was his daughter, but when he died, she and her mother were somehow ousted from the family fortune by his brothers. But Emperor Jahangir took the mother and Mariam into his harem, not as wives, but as honored wards, people who would be part of the household. And then when the first English ambassador, William Hawkins, came to India, Jahangir said to him, you're here, I'll give you a rank in my administration, and you need a wife to look after your household. And Hawkins, who was not married, said, oh, no, I couldn't possibly take a wife, and so on and so forth. And Jahangir said, well, here's a very fair maiden, she can become your wife. And he said, no, it's not the race issue, I really couldn't take someone who's not a Christian, try and get out of it. So Jahangir said, I've got Mariam, she's a Christian, marry her. So they actually married, first by a servant, since there were no ministers around, and later when they ran into an Anglican minister, they were married legally. So Mariam then marries William Hawkins. He's fairly popular at Jahangir's court until he comes drunk one day, and only Jahangir could get drunk, so he was sort of kicked out. And so he left, promising Mariam's family that they wouldn't leave India to reassure her mother. But in fact, they did leave India. They went aboard ship and sailed to England, and apparently she was willing to go with him. It's always a dilemma. Do you stay with your mother or with your husband? And she stayed with her husband, even though he was English. Alas, Hawkins died aboard ship. So she arrives as a widow in London. Fortunately, she happened to have some diamonds sewed into her clothing, so she wasn't destitute. And the East India Company, who had hired Hawkins, gave her his salary, so she had some position. And further, very soon after her arrival, she married another Englishman who happened to be the captain of another ship in the fleet coming back, Gabriel Towerson, and they're married in London in 1614. She lived a couple of years in London, and then Towerson decided he wanted to go back to India and use her connections with the imperial court, the Mughal court, and with her Armenian family in order to make his fortune. But he was not a very nice person. And so when they reached India, he alienated not only her family, but the imperial court, and also the English. And he left. He went off to Indonesia where the Dutch killed him. And she was left without alimony, not destitute, but not happily placed in London. And the last we see of her are plaintiff letters to the East India Company saying, please give me some money, some alimony, so I can live respectably. I'm the widow of this Englishman. So not everyone lived happily as a wife or child. But you have some examples, and these are actually the children of Kirkpatrick, who William Dalrymple has written about in The White Mughals, and Hyderabadi princess. Here they are in India. They went to England, and they were baptized, instead of being Sahiba Begum, Catherine Aurora Kirkpatrick, instead of being Asaf Alam, William George Kirkpatrick, and they got their father's money, at least some of it. So they entered into society, and here is Sahiba Begum, now Catherine Aurora Kirkpatrick, now Mrs. John Winslow Phillips. She marries into the middle classes or upper middle classes. And if I showed you this first, how many of you would say, oh, that's an Indian woman? So the belief tended to be that women could assimilate into their husband's culture more easily, were expected to. And so that a lot of the women who came became European. And if you actually do a study of the DNA of a lot of people living in England, there are some Indian genes, often from the mother's side. But the cultural heritage may have faded out as they moved into society. So we have then this experience, and of course we can look at every one of these people and they all have very rich experiences. What about scholars? From early on, the British realized that to do well in India they needed Indian languages. And who spoke Indian languages? So they hire Indians as munshis, as teachers, and some of them they bring back to England. So Mirza, who was an official in the British administration, was brought back to London with a sponsor to start a Persian academy in London. He was promised that if he came, he'd be very well paid, and he started a Persian academy. And he kept a diary, which he later wrote up in Persian, Masir Talibi, a fi Balad, Franji, Masir's, the account of Talib, Abu Talib in the land of the Franks. And he described his life in society in Persian. It was a manuscript during his lifetime. It's later published in translation and also in Persian. But it gives a good sense of arriving, what he found interesting about England, what he found provocative about it. And if you look at that Persian account, clearly designed for his friends, Persian reading friends back in India, he talks about things, for example, how English women only have one husband, or English men only have one wife, and that's maybe a little bit more modern than having multiple wives. And so he's writing to his friends saying we have to maybe become a little bit more like the English and modernize in that way. But before he left, he also, and here's another engraving of him, wrote The Vindication of the Liberties of Asiatic Women, which was translated in English under his supervision and published in multiple editions in the first part of the 19th century and in various European languages. And in this, he makes the case that Indian women are treated so much better by Indian men than European women are treated by Europeans. So using the idea of this treatment of women as a measure of the cultural validity, stature, but trying to show that Indian women were much better off. They didn't have to appear in public, they didn't have to get involved in business. If they didn't want to sleep with the husband, there was another wife to do it. So this was much, much better. Whereas the English people, they forced their women into public, they put on very revealing clothes. So it's really to show how great Indian women live for an English audience. So if you look at the Persian account, it's making one case about polygamy. If you're looking at the English account, it's a very different account because the audiences are different. And we have to keep in mind that whatever they're writing for, it's important to remember the agenda. You also find various teachers, and at the East India Company's college, there were a series of 5 different teachers who came from India, who taught British people. So the first Indian that a lot of these European colonialists to be met was their teacher. So what is your attitude toward a teacher who's teaching you Persian or Urdu or Hindustani? And then when you go to India, are you going to treat Indians the same way as you treated your teacher in England? So we're really talking about different lives, and most of these teachers married English women, had families, and so we're talking about a world in which these scholars are going back and forth. There were also quite a number of diplomats. Of course, as Britain becomes important, if you want to get political benefit, you have to send a delegation or go yourself to England. And so we have about 30 different diplomatic missions by the middle of the 19th century, where either royalty or their ambassadors went, and some of them wrote about their experiences. So one of the early travelers and embassies from the Mughal Emperor, Mirza Nizamuddin, wrote about his account. This is clearly not from life. This is a later picture from this translation. But the Shirkuhnama-i-Vilayat, the Wonder Book of Europe, which again talks about his life in England. Raja Ram Mohan Roy, as we know, was made a Raja by the Mughal Emperor in order to be an ambassador. He went to England in 1831, and unfortunately the climate didn't agree with him. He died, so he was buried there in Bristol. But again, he wrote a lot about his life as an ambassador and his life in England. So quite a number of people have made this journey, some staying for 10 or 15 years, some only very briefly going, but we can get a sense of what it was to be an official, an ambassador going. There were also many people who worked for the East India Company, and many of them ended up going to England and trying to get a pension or get a better deal. And if you look at one of the most famous, Mohanlal Kashmiri, who had been trained in Delhi in Persian diplomatics. He worked for the East India Company. He fairly rose high up. He was captured when the East India Company army was wiped out in Afghanistan. He helped them escape, and then he went to England in order to get a better pension. And while he was there, he published 2 books. One, Travel in the Punjab, and A Visit to Great Britain, which describes his trip to England, his career, and presents him, of course, in a very good light. And later he wrote, while again in England, The Life of Amir Dost Muhammad Khan of Kabul, about the first Afghan war that the British lost. And so he's there, he's writing about himself, and he was something of a celebrity. So he went to Edinburgh, and they take these early pictures of him, so we can compare the sketches that he commissioned versus real pictures of him, right? Photographs, which are supposed to be more real than pictures. And so we're talking about him as a presence. And of course, he has an effect on society. We also talk about various entrepreneurs. And here I'd like to focus on just one example to give a little bit more richness of the experience. Sheikh Dean Muhammad went to Britain in 1783. He died there in 1851. And while he went, he wrote, and if he's an Indian, because he was born in India, and Joseph Amin is not an Indian because he was born elsewhere, the first book by an Indian published in English. If not, it's the second book by an Indian, depending on how you do it. But there's a premium on being first. So this is the travels of Dean Muhammad, a native of Patna in Bengal, through several parts of India while in the service of the Honorable East India Company, written by himself. And as you know from English literature, the idea in the late 18th century, early 19th century of non-whites writing proved to skeptical European audiences that they were human, that they could write, they were skilled, they were literate. And so many books, including Equiano's autobiography just a few years earlier, are written by himself. Women also have in their autobiography written by herself, that being an author showed your humanity, your civilization. And so he wrote about it, but he also wrote as a series of letters to a friend. Now these are not real letters, these are this epistolary fiction. That is, he's dear sir, but it's just a general thing. But writing letters to a friend, and this is published in Ireland, so he's writing to Irish and English readers, as friends, suggests the arrangement, the relationship he's trying to establish. He talks about his life in this book. He was born in Patna in 1759. He traveled up and down the East India Company's territories. But he describes in his account what it was to leave his mother at age 11 and why he would join the East India Company's army, first as a camp follower and later as a soldier. So in his autobiography, he talks about how in 1769, when he was 11 years old, the local Raja had a palace where he was accustomed to entertain many distinguished European gentlemen with balls and costly suppers. My mother's house was not far, and the number of British officers passing attracted my notice and excited the ambition I had of entering a military life. Now you can imagine an 11-year-old seeing these officers, the East India Company officers going back and forth, being lavishly hosted by the local Raja in Patna, and why a young man would want to join them. So he left his mother, sort of ran away, and he joined in the entourage of a young Anglo-Irish officer. And then he went back, and he had a parting with his mother. And he talks about how he told her that he was not coming back, he was going to stay with the British. Her disappointment smote my soul. She was silent. I perceived some tears succeeding each other, stealing down her cheeks. My heart was wrung. At length, my resolution was fixed. She dragged herself away and let me go. Now, part of this is just a stylized trope. Many autobiographies talk about the sorrowful parting from their mothers, but I think here he's writing 30 years later about this experience of leaving his mother and committing himself to the service of the British, first as a camp follower, and then he rose up to actually be a subadar, which is as high as soldiers could get who were not European at this time. And from Patna, he spent about 15 years moving around, fighting battles against what we would consider other Indians. And you have to ask, by the time he died, about 250,000 Indians had joined the East India Company's army. So the whole question about Is there a sense of India? Do you see yourself as a traitor that you're supporting these Europeans against other Indians? Or was India so fragmented that you didn't necessarily see yourself as, in nationalist eyes, turning against your family or your culture? And then in 1784, his patron, Captain Baker, he doesn't mention in his autobiography, Dean Muhammad doesn't, that Baker had been court-martialed, but we can find that out from the other records, decided to go back to Europe. And Dean Muhammad, at this point, he's about 25, decides to go with him, having a desire of seeing that part of the world and convinced I should suffer uneasiness of mind in the absence of my best friend. So it's his patron and his best friend who's helped his military career. He resigned his commission and went to Cork, Ireland. By sea, he actually went on a Danish ship, and he settled in Cork, probably the only settled Indian in Cork at the time. There may have sailors coming through, where Baker's father had been the mayor. So he talks about living in Ireland, and that's really the end of his autobiography. But of course he didn't die. One of the things that he did was he published his book, which he wrote, 2 volumes, and published and sold to various people. And we also have an account by another traveler who we've seen before, Abu Khalil Khan, who happened, because of adverse winds, to go ashore in Cork, and happened to meet, and he describes it in his account, another person in the Baker house named Dean Muhammad. He's from Murshidabad, a brother of Baker, raised him from childhood as a member of the family, brought him to Cork, sent him to school, where he learned to read and write in English. After studying, he eloped with a daughter, fair and beautiful daughter of a family of rank in Cork, who was a student in another school, and he married her. And the Persian term is nikah, so we're talking about formal marriage. And he has several beautiful children with her. He has a separate house and wealth, and he wrote a book containing some account of himself about India. So we have intertextually Dean Muhammad's book being mentioned, and his wife and family being mentioned in the account of another traveler. So we're talking about ways that you can make these kinds of connections. And then, after about 15 years, and I'm not sure exactly why, he went from Cork to London. And in London, he started first as a massage therapist, but saved enough money to start a restaurant. So the first restaurant in London, run by an Indian, serving Indian food. There had been ones by British people, but did they get Indian food right? That's the question. So here he is, the Hindustani coffee house, in which Muhammad, clearly the same Dean Muhammad, informs the nobility and gentry. He's fitted up the house neatly and elegantly. You can have a hookah there with special chillum tobacco and Indian dishes and curries and wine. And he ran this restaurant for a couple of years. And then, alas, it went bankrupt. Clearly, if you wanted Indian food, you were probably wealthy enough as an Englishman that you could have an Indian cook. Why should you go to a restaurant? So Dean Muhammad's restaurant, unfortunately, went bankrupt. It's still commemorated by the Indian community as the first Indian restaurant owned by Dean Muhammad. So after all, it's commemorated, it has to be true, and also there's tax records, so we know it was there. There's actually a restaurant review that gives it a very good review, but it went bankrupt. So what does he do? What kinds of skills could he have? He's managed a household in Cork. He's a restaurateur. He advertises himself as a butler. So in the newspaper, he says, Muhammad of the Hindustani Coffee House wants to work in a gentleman's family as a butler or valet. He's acquainted with marketing, capable of conducting his business in the kitchen, and no objection to town or country. So he tried to get a job as the head of a household. It didn't seem to work, but then he decided to go from London down to Brighton. And if you've been in Brighton, of course, the Brighton Pavilion is this pseudo-oriental building put up by, of course, the Prince Regent, later George IV. And in Brighton, Dean Muhammad decided that he would become the shampooing surgeon. So you know this chumpy, right? So he made that very fashionable. He had no training in it, but he made himself very fashionable as a shampooing surgeon. And he actually convinced the royal family to let him be, by appointment, the shampooing surgeon to the royal family in Brighton. And so he massaged a number of the royalty. Queen Victoria didn't go for it, but George went for it. And so that you're talking about him rising up. He married Mrs. Muhammad, Jane Muhammad. Mrs. actually had 2 English wives. It was a little awkward because they overlapped before the first one died. And they were both named Jane. But nonetheless, here she is, Jane Muhammad, who is doing, of course, the massage for the ladies, since he can't do that. And he set himself up as a shampooing surgeon. And here he's looking pretty middle class, pretty confident in Western clothes. And he wrote case books that describe how great he was, cases cured by Sheikh Deen Muhammad, shampooing surgeon, and inventor of the Indian medicated vapor and seawater baths. Okay, you're all familiar with vapor and seawater baths, right, that are famous in India. Well, he invented this. He was able to get a bathhouse, which he decorated Indian style with murals and so on. And it was quite prominent. It was right on the seashore, and lots of people went. It was sort of a thing when you went to Brighton, you did, is you had a bath and a massage by Deen Muhammad or by Jane Muhammad, his wife, if you're a woman. And this is the apparatus that he invented. So you heat up water, and then the water goes, there's Deen Muhammad, in the pipe, it gets cooled, and here's where the herbs and oils get infused, and what comes out is a very cool vapor, and you're in this chamber filled with this cool steam. So the Indian medicated vapor bath. Now clearly this is not something that's widespread in India, but he sort of invented it. But he became quite famous as this bath keeper. It was a very prominent thing to do in Brighton if you went. And he was not modest about advertising himself and all the things that could be cured. So here's another picture of the bathhouse. You get a sense of how prominent it was. He also wrote another book, Shampooing or the Benefits Resulting from the use of the Indian medicated vapor bath, in 3 editions, so it kept selling out. And you can imagine what it cured. It cured everything you could possibly think of if you would just go and get this bath. But curiously, if you actually look at the way he's presented himself, sort of Indian clothing, but he's got boots on. This is not the Brighton Pavilion. It sort of almost looks like a mosque, so it's oriental, but it's in Brighton. But he describes himself saying, and this is as it was published in 1822, the humble author of these sheets, a native of India, was born in 1749. How many of you have good memory? When was he actually born? So what has he done? He's made 10 years more of his life in which he could get training as a medical surgeon. So suddenly he trained in Calcutta for 10 years as a surgeon, and that qualifies him. But he's left out the whole Ireland bit, the whole bankers in London. He makes himself 10 years older, but it made him more saleable as a doctor. And then he describes how he was educated in the profession and served in the East India Company's service as a surgeon, and then he became a soldier, so suddenly there's 10 years as a surgeon. And then in 1784, I left the service and came to Europe, where I've resided ever since. The implication is he's been in Brighton, and if you read the histories of Brighton, he has been there since 1784. So the first whole part of his life in Europe is gone. It doesn't serve his purposes. It's the same man, we know it's the same man, but he's presented himself in a very different way, as advertisers, patent medicine salesmen tend to do. So he's very creatively creating this role for himself as the shampooing surgeon. And here's another painting of him. For 50 years since my first arrival in England, and a successful practice as the shampooing surgeon for 50 years. So in other words, he had to be there in Brighton for 50 years for this to be true. So again, he's constructed his life. But he became a local celebrity, something that people in going to Brighton would look forward to doing. And he's also celebrated in Brighton today. So for a long time, in the hotel, the Queen's Hotel, which was built on the site of his bathhouse, there was the Deen Muhammad cocktail bar, where you could go and drink in Deen Muhammad's name. Right? There is a bus route, and the Sheikh Deen Muhammad bus route in Brighton, where you can go and get on his bus. So he's a local celebrity. He had children who went on to become surgeons. One became a very famous guy's hospital surgeon. They became a fencing teacher, and so they moved into society, and his great-grandchildren, they have this vague memory of this guy, Din Muhammad, who came, but they're more or less English. One branch has the Muhammad name, but the others don't. But again, there's been a cultural assimilation over the 150 years that the family's been there. But while he was in town, Din Muhammad settled. He had enough property that he could vote, so he voted for members of parliament, he voted in local elections, and he was a local prominent person. Now obviously, not everyone was so successful, but there were a number of tourists who wrote about their experiences. A very different account, but roughly the same time, a man named Kolal Pasha, that was his sort of nickname. He was a soldier, he worked in the Lucknow area, and he decided he just wanted to go to England for the sake of it. So he wrote an Urdu account of the wonders of the West, in which he describes, in Urdu for an Urdu audience, living in England and what it was like in his interactions with various people, and then he went home. And so that you have a number of different people who came for various purposes. Gil very kindly mentioned Sombre, who was of mixed ancestry. The difficulty with paintings is that the patron says how fat you are. So in his diary, he says he was about 250 pounds and about 5 foot high. But he looks clearly thinner in this. So he paid Rocky, who was a society painter, a lot of money to make him look thinner. He was also, by his own account, much darker of complexion. So he sort of changed himself in this record. But he was very wealthy. Within a few months of being in England, he first got engaged to a viscount's daughter, he married her. It was unfortunately not a very happy marriage. He was elected to Parliament. So again, the first Indian elected to the British Parliament from Sudbury, just east of London. After about 9 months, he voted, but after 9 months, the voters of Sudbury were the ones who were corrupt. He gave the money, but they took it. So Sudbury was disenfranchised, and he and an Englishman who was also voted in. It was a 2-member constituency, was kicked out. But unless he was in Parliament, and then he was declared a lunatic by his family. I'd be glad to go into the details if you'd like, but essentially he was a little bit possessive about his wife to the extent he wouldn't let her go out. He accused men of looking at her and therefore insulting his honor. He challenged men to duels over his honor, and he insisted that she should fight duels with women over his honor because he was flirting, so he didn't quite fit in. Finally, his family had him arrested as a lunatic, and it was very long cases, elaborate cases. What it came down to was he was of mixed ancestry. If he would admit to being Indian, then they would let him go as sane. Because the British judge believed that all Indian men were obsessively jealous of their womenfolk, so he's acting perfectly normal if he were Indian. But if he was European, which is what he claimed, no European man would act like that toward his wife, and therefore he was a lunatic. So he's arrested, he escaped in the middle of the night and went to France, and in France everyone said he was perfectly sane. So he spent 8 years trying to prove he was not a lunatic, which he never managed to do. But he did write, and here he is, looking more or less sane, or a lunatic, you decide. He did write 2 books, Refutation of the Charge of Lunacy brought against him in the Court of Chancery, which he published in Paris. Unfortunately, if you read it closely, it doesn't really convince you that he was sane. Because he'll have document, and then he'll refute it in his own footnote. So it wasn't quite there. And it was ghostwritten. And he later did a humble petition to the Lord Temporal, Spiritual, and Commoners assembled in Parliament that he distributed in London to try to convince people that he was sane. Again, he never managed to actually do that. So these were entrepreneurs or travelers. And I'll just end, because I'm moving on in terms of time, looking at various kinds of students. Now, as British society developed certain kinds of technologies, it became attractive to go. As Christianity was trying to prove that it was superior to Indian religions, a number of Indians converted to Christianity and decided to go. And then, of course, there were also people who went for medical knowledge. I mean, real students of medicine, not like in Muhammad, who went to get higher medical training in London. And we can look just at a couple of examples of these. In Bombay, there was a very effective shipbuilding industry run by Parsi family. and they built really good ships. But when it came time to put high-pressure steam engines in ocean-going ships, they needed English technology. So what we find is two cousins and their distant cousin went to England for 3 years to study as engineers, naval engineers. And they got apprenticeship in the shipworks, but they also wrote about their experiences. And these are fascinating. They're engineers, so what do? They do a time and motion study of the British omnibus system. Right? So they wrote down hour by hour who gets on the buses, how do they behave. So it's a sociological study of English society by some engineers. It's very interesting how they do it. Then they tell, this is written for other Indians, it's sort of a guidebook to London. When you go into a theater, how can you tell the respectable women from the sex workers? Right? Because you don't want to get in trouble. So they described how the signs of a respectable woman from not so respectable. What kind of seats do you buy? Well, if you buy just the lowest class seats, you're going to get pushed around. But if you get slightly higher seats, you'll get better treatment. If you get the highest seats, it's too expensive, it's not worth it. So how can you maximize your ticket buying in the theaters in London? This is the kind of thing that they write about. And so in their Journal of a Residence of 2.5 years in London, published in London before they left, they describe this process about living in England as engineering students. Another man, of course, who went, very famous later, Kursaji from a similar Parsi family, made 4 trips to England, and he wrote a diary of an overland journey from Bombay to England and of a year's residence in Great Britain, and he actually became a commissioned covenanted official, the first Indian covenanted official in the engineering department. So he actually rose up quite high. He made 4 trips to England, and he actually died on the last trip. But he's commemorated, of course, by Indian stamps, because here he is as someone who made good. And then the very last person that I'll talk about fairly briefly, a number of people went to become Christian. So Danjibai Narojji became a Christian, a Scottish Presbyterian. He went to England to get higher training. And if you know your Scottish church history, which I'm sure you all do, there was a great split in the Scottish church, and the deed of demission was this split in the church. And can you pick him out? These were a series of pictures that are sort of glued in like a collage. But there he is. So he's there at the founding of this branch of the Scottish church. So fairly prominent position. A number of people went and had different experiences as medical, engineering, or Christian students, a whole range of different people who went. And so we can really talk about broad patterns. There's a great diversity. The experience varied a lot by who you were when you went. Your purpose, your attitude, your gender, your class, and also the time period. It changed a lot over these periods from 1600. If you're one of the first to go in 1600, the English don't know how to handle it. By you get to the 19th century, they've seen a number of Indians and they know what an Indian is. So when you have Gandhi or Nehru or Jinnah going, they're going to people who already have ideas about it. But if you're talking about Mariam or you're talking about someone in the 17th century, they don't have a clue really about what Indian is. And you have a chance to shape yourself. I'm the shampooing surgeon, right? How do they know? So we're talking about changes over time that affect their lives in Britain. Further, gradually, as colonialism kicks in, there was increasing recognition that British culture was dominant and that you could really see how British and also to some extent Indians became a little bit more accepting of British moral, cultural, religious claims of superiority. After all, they had the power, they had the money, they were the ones that brought you. And so even if you resisted that when you went as an Indian, there was a sense that maybe it's a slightly defensive attitude toward British culture. We don't want to really see them as superior, but we have to recognize they have something. And so there's a shift over time that we can talk about. But what we're really describing is the extending of the history of India beyond South Asia. And I've tried to make the case that there's this complex counter, which is worthy of note, not often talked about, but something that really gives us a different sense of this time period and the interaction between Indians and Britons, both in India and also in Britain. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for that fascinating talk, which touches on not only individual life stories that are probably unknown to most of us here, but also a larger pattern of what you call a counterflow to colonialism. That term, counterflow to colonialism, I think is wonderfully ambivalent, because on the one hand it suggests something counter to colonialism that works against it. But there's also a counterflow to colonialism. It's part of colonialism as well. And something that we might talk about is the extent to which these patterns of reverse migration from India to England are perhaps less disruptive than they are constitutive of the larger machinery of colonialism, which is of course unfolding not just in India itself, but transnationally. Something else that came out of Michael's talk that I think is fascinating, it was beautifully illustrated in the graphic image of the Mughal Empire expanding and diminishing like some kind of mutating protozoa, is that India is not a fixed entity. India is something that keeps transforming. India is multiple. And the Indians who migrate to England are often not Indian in the sense we might think. And indeed, they might not even think of themselves straightforwardly as Indian. An issue we might talk about is, yes, there's extraordinary diversity of religion and culture amongst the Indian migrants to England. But it's also interesting to note who isn't represented amongst these migrants. Most of them come from somewhat marginal communities in India itself. Armenian Christians, for instance, Parsis, Persian Muslims. And it is interesting that we don't see in the incredibly rich archive that you revealed here, migrant Hindus. Is it simply the restriction against travelling across the Kalapani, or are there other factors behind why non-Hindus are pretty much exclusively represented in this archive? In any case, the floor is open for questions now, and we have quite a bit of time in which to take questions. So if anyone would like to ask Michael a question, do we have microphones going around? Nothing to be asked of me. Yes, let's start here in the front, and there are microphones coming around.
My question is to Professor Fisher. In his account, he told that Portuguese discovered the Sea Road in 1497. And at that time only the counterflow started. It went to Portugal first, and then from there to England. And when the first ship from England came to India, Indians were there. Now, between this time, there were French coming in, Dutch, Danes, Portuguese were there. Now, why the counterflow wasn't so significant, or isn't so significant with the other, countries, European countries? Because there is a variation, there is a lot of variation, but it went towards English, but why not these cultures?
Yes, you're absolutely right, and I, not artificially, but I made a decision to focus. First of all, as we know, the English were the most prominent and the most numbers of people who went England. But you're absolutely right. There's some very good work by Sanjay Subramaniam about people who went to Portugal from early 16th century onward, and I guess, as you say, some of those ended up in England as well. The focus on sort of counterflows to imperialism led me to concentrate for this study on that particular stream. But you're absolutely right. If we look at the Dutch and Indonesians, for example, one could certainly make the case that there was a counterflow of Indonesians of mixed ancestry or Indonesians of Indonesian going to Holland. The other European powers, less so perhaps in Asia. You do have a number of Christian converts coming from China, coming from Southeast Asia, who are brought either to France or to Italy. So yes, you do have these numbers. If you're looking at the Americas, there are a surprising number of people from the Americas who end up in Spain or Portugal or Britain. So the idea that it's people coming in is universal. I would suggest that almost all the people coming in are coming on European ships. So there's some control or some constraint by the European ship owners about who comes in. And that tracks or channels certain catchment areas. India largely toward England or toward Portugal, and the other colonies, the Dutch, for example, don't have so much of a presence. But then from Indonesia, you would have that. So you're absolutely right. This is, I hope, opening up a larger study of lots of global migrations over long periods of time to multiple sites, not just one, but to others. And so I felt this was maybe just the first tentative step toward a broader project that you're talking about. Yes.
Thank you for that wonderful lecture. I wanted to ask you if you came across any instances of artists, musicians, dancers, etc. being taken to Europe and England in particular. I mean, I have in mind, I think in the late 18th century, some Devadasis or some dancers from South India were taken in a group to England, and I think Jeb Bore has written about it. But if you came across any more, like a group, if one could talk of, to add to that list which you shared.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, there are people who are coming, they, as you say, tend to be a little bit later. So if you look at the 1850s and 60s, there are troops of people singing songs, sort of street entertainers, many of them with, mostly male, but with either Arabic, Persian, or Indian origins. And of course the British don't really describe the differences among those. So there are some accounts, the London Poor and London Labour book by Mayhew, he goes and he looks at lots of street people, Irish and gypsies or travelers, but he also has a couple of chapters about Indian street people. This is the 1860s. So if you'd like to look at Mayhew's book, it's I think a 4-volume book, but it's London Labour and London Poor. It has quite early documentation about a variety of entertainers. I may not be able to give you a singer, but I can give you a cheetah trainer, okay? Which is maybe the best I can do. But you find that one of the things that, if you want to please a British patron, you do is you make an exotic gift. And India is filled with exotic animals. So rhinoceroses, elephants, in this case the caracal, which is a kind of cheetah creature, were sent to England by people who wanted to get in good with the king. And so you can send a cheetah, but you can't send a cheetah alone. Right? You need someone who, for the 6 months of the voyage, will take care of the cheetah aboard ship. And so a man named Abdullah from Murshidabad came in 1759 with this cheetah, which he presented. It was actually a gift to the royal family from Mir Jafar, who the British put on the throne in Bengal. And so that this was a gift that was celebrated in the newspapers. It's probably not an accurate picture of him in the sense that he, here we go. that he sort of stylized, and the cheetah is anatomically not quite correct, but close. So they didn't want to get too close to the cheetah before they did. So anyway, they arrived, this was celebrated. Here the cheetah is killing a chicken, which isn't that hard to do, but caught and killed the chicken. And then ultimately, the cheetah ended up in the Tower of London, which was a zoo at the time. But Abdullah was actually treated very well. He got first-class patches back. He was given gifts by the British, and so he made the trip quite successfully. In fact, it was so successful that he came 3 times with 3 gifts of cheetah. This is the last one that we know about. There may have been a 4th, but this is the last one we know about, painted by George Stubbs, who was very good at animals and anatomy. And so he came this time under the name of John Morgan. We know it's the same man, but he's willing to go under this name because the British have a little trouble with Abdullah, pronouncing it and so on. And we know a considerable amount about him because he was out training the cheetah once in Kew Garden, right? And they were training it to go after stags, but the cheetah decided to not go after stags and went off and got a rabbit instead. So there's this account of the cheetah sort of being slightly anticlimactically not killing the stags. But this was a big thing. But it took a while. And so he was caught on the outskirts of London, and it got dark. So he went into a rooming house, and in the middle of the night, the rooming house keeper came in and stole his clothing and his gold coins. And we have a list of all the things that were stolen. And he ran out in sort of his nightgown and got the police to arrest this guy. And so the innkeeper was put on trial for stealing his clothes. There's a list of everything that's taken. There's the constable's account. And John Morgan had to explain who he was. So we have a biography which goes back, I came 3 times, I came as Abdullah, and now I'm under John Morgan. So we have a autobiography, and of course he won. And I think the innkeeper was convicted. I think he was sent to Australia, which is what you did with convicted criminals in those days. So he was sent off. But here we have a picture of him with an assistant, clearly from life by a fashionable painter. So cheetah handlers is perhaps the best I can do.
It is not clear to me where and in which languages were the books written by Mohanlal Kashmiri and D.N. Mahomet written. Mohanlal Kashmiri had written about his visit to UK, England, and Mahomet had written about his travels in Bengal.
Yes.
What I want to know, while writings on Bengal may be of interest to us, why would it interest English people? Because it is about the society of those times. And while I could gather a lot of valuable material has been retrieved from the archives, it is strange that our history books don't talk about many of these personalities excepting Raja Ram Mohan Rai because of the Renaissance movement in West Bengal. Is it true that he died and he was cremated in England?
Yes, he was in Bristol.
Okay. And about the first 2 things, in which language were the books written and are they available today?
Yes, again, a very good question. When you're writing a book, you have a choice of audiences, and the language often reflects your choice of audiences. So the Persian accounts are not going to be widely read in England. They tended to be also left in manuscript. Printing doesn't really come in effectively in Indian languages until a little bit later in the 19th century, 1830s, 40s, begin to get publications in Indian languages, printed publications for a larger audience. So in the case of Joseph Amin, he decided to publish in London. In part, he was still trying to prove to his British employers that he was a worthy gentleman, that he had stature, and so on. He was trying to get a pension. He was retired, but they didn't know whether he should get a European pension, which was higher, or an Indian pension, which was lower. So there was sort of an agenda. Here I am. I had served in the English Royal Army for a while. I'm a man who was literate. And also he describes that the costs of printing in London were so much lower, even in English, than they were in Calcutta, that you get a better market and you would also get cheaper costs. So he advertised the book in Calcutta newspapers, but it was printed in London. He his book is reprinted by a great-granddaughter. It's reprinted in the United States, but the copies are not widely available, alas. The Deen Muhammad is more widely available. There's an OUP, Oxford Delhi edition of it that came out that I reprinted the book with a biography, which is available, I think, still, certainly in libraries. But I'm sure online you can get the Deen Muhammad's book. Do you know Google Books? Do you know this site? It's books.google.com. You can get books out of print, which include this, freely downloaded in sort of PDF format, and you could certainly get his book. You could probably get Amin's book as well out of that. So it's available in print. It's also available, the Deen Muhammad book, also available in downloads. And again, Deen Muhammad was in Cork, Ireland. He had married a Cork woman. He didn't expect to go back to India. And he wanted to demonstrate to the patrons and the people around in Ireland and England that he was sort of one of them. So again, his choice was to publish in English for a British audience. And this letters to a friend, to an English friend. At one point he talks about how the peasants of India are like our peasants here in Ireland in this feature. So he's trying to say us meaning Anglo-Irish, although sometimes, and for much of the book, he says us meaning Indians. So he's really talking about this split identity. And a number of scholars of English have taken up this book now that it's known about more, and done some very interesting analysis about authorship and intentionality and cultural studies and deconstruction and all the things that some people in English do. So that's there. Why would the English care? That's a key question. This was not a bestseller, right? He published, we know, about 350 copies. There may have been more. And it largely disappeared. So in the National Library of Ireland, they only have volume 1. The British Library has both volumes, but they bought it actually from a collector. There's one copy in Calcutta that Dwarkanath Tagore had brought back with him. So in the National Library in Calcutta, there's one copy of it. And then I found a copy, although I couldn't actually go in very deeply, in a nunnery in Cork, where somehow they had gotten it. And it was in their library, and of course you knock on the door, and they have to bring it out, because I should have had my wife with me, to go into the library of the nunnery. So it wasn't widely distributed. So to some extent, your point is, the British didn't care all that much about Calcutta or about Bengali life. They wanted to know enough that they could function there, so they want language teachers, they want a certain expertise, but again, they're really pushing from 1845 onward to get educated Indians to do English, right? So English people, with many distinguished exceptions, are notoriously bad about language training, language study other than English. Americans are much worse, right? So there was a question, they had to do, the Indians had to do it in our language. We are not going to, with, again, some distinguished exceptions, really project that much. And if you look at what Deen Muhammad put in, it's really quite interesting. About 10 to 15% of the book is plagiarized. Now, in the 18th century, plagiarism was not a problem, but there was an account by a man named John Gross, about 20 years earlier, about India. And Deen Muhammad took whole paragraphs out of that, and the entire glossary, for the most part, out of that, in part describing things that he didn't see. So, for example, Gross talks about Mumbai, Bombay in those days. And Deen Muhammad had never been there. So he put in a chapter about Mumbai, implying he had been there, but it's actually Gross's words. But there were also some other curious things which we can puzzle over why he put it. When he's describing betel nut, he takes Gross's, not Gross in an ugly sense, John Gross's account of betel nut. Now clearly he knew what betel nut was, but he decided for some reason that Gross's account of that and dancing women were also taken from Gross. So those sorts of things, he was maybe saying, okay, if the English like this and Gross was a better seller, maybe I should just copy that. There's some Latin verses in it to show he's elite. There's some poetry, which is not great poetry, and I can't tell if he made it up or It was the sort of thing that friends would. So we're not sure exactly about, maybe he had some advisors, his wife perhaps, or other people who gave him advice, what to put in. So he's trying to shape his identity for a British audience. Not so much because he's published in Ireland, in English, for an Indian audience, because he's not going back. The ones writing in Persian, or in Urdu, or Nepali, they're writing for audiences back home, and I think it's framed somewhat differently. Why these are not studied in terms of either Indian accounts or British history, and there's a whole activist movement to try to get South Asian, Indian history written back into the British curriculum. I think it's because these people don't fit into national histories. Okay? So they're Indian, but they're not in India. They're in England, but they're not English. They don't really fit into these national identities. And if you had to decide whom you wanted to have as the first Indian in the British Parliament, would you have this lunatic who was eventually kicked out, or would you have Dadabhai Naoroji, who does appear in all the accounts as the first Indian in the British Parliament? Admirable figure, national leader, he wrote accounts, good economist. He actually started his career in England teaching Gujarati at University College London, but he worked his way up. And so if you had to have the first Indian in the British Parliament, you'd much rather have him than Daisambre, mixed ancestry, maybe a lunatic, not all that nice a person. Do you really want children to be inspired by him or by Dadabhai Naoroji? So there's certain national agendas in terms of education which have largely meant these people tend to not fit in, and real efforts by both scholars and also activists in Britain to write them back into the history of Britain and maybe by extension into India.
I think we've got time for another question here at the back.
Thank you. One observation from on what you said, Dr. Gil Harris, about and then two clarifications, requests for clarification, regarding the observation you made about Indians coming to England and yet not being very clearly recognizable as Indians because of the variable nature of the Indian identity. I think you could say the same about, at about the same time, about a number of European countries, particularly Germany and Italy. You know, Italians were coming to England, but they were not Italians. They were Calabrese, Sardinians, Napolitans, and I think the same can be said about India. Now, the two requests for clarification. One is about Dai Song. He also was known as Octoloni. Was he related to the Begum Samru and to Octoloni, who supposedly became a lover after he took over Sultana? And regarding the other Naoroji who converted to the Scottish Church, which is a very rare thing among Parsis, he must have been related to Dadabhai Naoroji.
I think in the Parsi tradition, starting with the last question, I think in the Parsi tradition, you often have the name of the father as your surname. So I'm not sure if it's a clan name or whether this, I don't know much about him, I'll ask. So it's possible, certainly Parsi community is not that big. They must have been related in some way, but not closely related to Dadabhai Naoroji. As far as the Daisamra, you're absolutely right. Begum Samru Sardana had been the slave of this man's great-grandfather. And she adopted Daisamre as a young boy, took away from the mother and raised him as her child and heir. And when the British took over, started on 1839, Daisamre got the equivalent of about £5 million sterling in today's terms. So a lot of money. So he was very rich, but the British had taken over his state, and so he's a disinherited princeling, but not really, because he was Catholic, mixed ancestry, of this dancing woman, former slave, and so his status was very ambiguous. And if you actually look at his diary, parts of which have been preserved, when he goes to Calcutta, for example, he discovers he's black, right? In Sardana, outside of Delhi, he was a princeling, he was rich, he had a certain status. He gets to Calcutta, And even middle-class English people say, oh, if you weren't rich, you black people would not. So he discovers his race when he gets into society and then aboard ship, and he talks about, oh, what it is to be a half-caste. And so he's really coming to a new identity as he enters British society. But he's got lots of money. This is a family, a family that can use money. And so the woman and he, the Viscount's daughter and he, get engaged. And the father actually says, well, you know, I wouldn't have chosen him. He's a Catholic, we're low church Protestants, he's obese, he doesn't smell like good, he's dark, but he's got lots of money, and if my daughter wants him. So clearly he's not fitting in very well. It's a very abrasive kind of role. So it's a very fascinating life, and you know, there's all these complications that we'd like to try to sort out. But I'm sorry, you were also talking about the nation state, right? This is the question addressed to you about Italians and Germans.
I'm not going to answer that question, but I want to make sure that people in the audience have time.
Yeah,
how much more time do we have, by the way?
It's 8:38.
We can go till 8:45.
8:45. Okay, that gives us a bit more time. So yes, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you for the interesting presentation, sir. Lots of answer you gave, and I got my answer as well. I have just a few queries, one or two. First, about the sources you come across and research on that. Well, as you mentioned, some biographies and all these things. And second thing, I just want to know, these people, they were going to the Britain, London. They were the kind of some beneficiaries people from the process of colonialism. They were getting the opportunity to go somewhere and do some work. You found some critical kind of notion from them about colonialism in these writings somewhere, any kind of.
Yes, thank you. You're absolutely right. The sources are important. Had this been a more academic audience, I would have talked about them more. Basically, you have not only these texts written by Indians that I've tried to highlight, but also you have a whole array of British records that really don't have any particular interest in Indians, but catch them up. I call them sort of domestic records. So the British do a census starting in the early 19th century. They want to count everyone. So if you happen to be an Indian living in a house on the census day, they write you down, they write down your age, your name, marriage status, and where from. But they're not looking for Indians, they're looking for everybody. Similarly, they have birth, death records, baptismal records, and again, they want to catch up everybody. The tax keeper, right, the tax collector, he comes to a house, he wants the portrait. He doesn't care who you are, he wants the money. So that you look in these domestic British records, and you get fragments of people. In court records, they always have, court records are often kept. The Old Bailey papers, for example, are online, and you can read long accounts by people when they arrive, and either they were plaintiffs or they were defendants in these criminal trials. And some of them were from Asia, and they have their autobiographies preserved that way. Not that the courts were looking for them particularly, but you get caught up in it. And so one of the things that you find about doing British history, in comparison to doing Indian history, which I've done a lot of as well, is that the records are much more complete, they're preserved, and they often try to be universal, so you can meet everybody. And so that enables you through intertextuality. You find one tiny reference here, you're seeing a picture there, you're seeing some evidence there, and you can begin to put it together. And if you'll permit me to give just one perhaps colorful example, the British are always doing paintings of dead Indians, right? So when General Bayard killed Tipu Sultan, his widow wanted to have a commemorative painting of his finding the body of Tipu Sultan for the sake of the glory of their family. So we have an artist, a man named David Wilkie, who was a fairly prominent artist. He needs Indian subjects. He doesn't know what Indians look like. So he goes to the East India Company headquarters, and he finds these Indians hanging around, and he recruits them as models for his picture. He's got plenty of booty, crowns, swords, but he doesn't have any actual Indians. So he goes and he recruits these guys to be the subjects, one to be Tipu Sultan, one to be the soldiers finding him, and so on. And he hires these people, and if you look at their accounts, you don't know what's going on at first, except that the artist studio is very cold, and they're shivering because they're not wearing many clothes. So that they're really talking about this guy, this weird guy, is giving us money just to lie there with not much clothes on while he paints us. Then they discover that they're being painted as Tipu Sultan. And at that point, if you look at Baird's account, suddenly for no reason they got up and ran away and never came back. From their account, they realized that they were being painted as Tipu Sultan, and they had been in the army fighting against Tipu Sultan. And so they said, I don't want to be Tipu Sultan, what if my mother sees this picture, right? So they run out of the studio and run away. They were actually soldiers, petty officers, who had been wronged. That is, they had been fired unjustly by their British officer. And they had made their way to London to complain, in the belief that if they just went over the heads of the British in India, they would get justice. And I think this is one of the central false hopes that a lot of Indian subjects and British subjects in Africa and China as well. If you could just get to the Queen or just get to the Prime Minister, they would right the wrongs done by their underlings who didn't understand. So they had gone to complain, and right after they stopped being Tipu Sultan, they got a hearing and they got some justice, so they went home. So we have people who were not directly beneficiaries of colonialism in the sense that they felt wrong, but they went there in order to get justice. But they're also caught up in this. And only when you begin to put these little tiny pieces together does the mosaic begin to be meaningful. And so here's the final picture of Baird and these Indian subjects, and he's finding the body of Tipu Sultan. So it's very triumphalist British, but these are Indian faces and Indian people who are caught up in this colonial project in a way that we can maybe undo or see to some extent the artist's models speaking back at least a little bit to the dominant theme of this is British art history.
Can I ask you a question? Can I ask you a question, Michael? Many of the people you've spoken about are, in effect, lone wolves. Mirza Abu Talib Khan Isfahani, Mohanlal Kashmiri, and various others. I mean, you have the group of three Parsis, the engineering students working together. But the archive seems to throw many of these cases that are almost sort of eccentric individual specimens. Yet the story you've just told points to something else, as did that fleeting reference to an inn in which Indian men, I presume, Lascars,
Yes.
would convene. So what sense do you have of migrant Indian communities forming during this period, no matter how small and fugitive and temporary they may be? And what is the constitution of these communities? Do people come together because they have a sense of themselves as coming from the same part of the world? Do you get Bengalis and Gujaratis and Maharashtrians coming together? Or do they tend to belong to the same community when they do convene? To what extent does language, religion, and various other factors shape the formation of migrant Indian communities at this time?
Yes, again, very, very good questions. And I think it goes back to this issue about are they seen as Indians or not? In part, you can look at the history of India as a nation state in the way that British rules forced people together. So Bengalis and Gujaratis come together in part because of their common experience of the British Raj. And to some extent this happens in England as well. I mean, a curry, he's going to vary between Madras or Bengal, but it's better than English boiled vegetables, right? So there's a sense that you have sort of three types of communities, and I'll be brief. You have, within households of elite English people, 4 or 5 servants, and clearly they're going to congregate. They would probably all come from the same general area because that's where their employer came from, so that they would be Bengalis together or Madrasis together, something like that. The second major community is the Lascars, who come in enough numbers that the east side of London becomes known as the Oriental Quarter. And there's not just Indians broadly, there's also Arab sailors, there's Chinese, but the East India Company sets up a dormitory, a very large dormitory, within which Indians largely run things. So there's a gate, you have to be in at night or else you're locked out, but once you're in, you're given raw food, empty rooms, and people organize themselves into messes, presumably by ethnic group or religious group, and diet, whatever. So they're cooking the food together under the leadership of their headman, the sarong, the bosun, and they form these communities, and the whole of this barracks is the heart of the Oriental Quarter, surrounded by people who will buy their clothing in exchange for money that they need, and sex workers and innkeepers. So there's, in the east side of London, and you can sort of see where it is over time, there is a substantial community. I have written a piece about this. So there is that community. The third type that I can briefly talk about is when you have these embassies. They were often very large. So when Nawab ul-Dawla, who was a claimant to the throne of Oghuz, thought he could get inheritance, not be disowned, but be the next ruler of Oghuz, he went with a fairly substantial delegation to London. He had a pension, and so he had enough money to pay for this. So that there are a number of servants, and there was about 20 people in the entourage. And this is actually pictures by a woman who was living in the same part of London that they were, and sort of saw them pass. So this is the claimant of the Oghuz throne, and there was a substantial body there. And so around them, people would come who wanted this companionship or this sense of being in this environment. You have a delegation from the Peshwas, and Rango Bapuji was the main survivor, but there are about 30 people in all, 3 missions. So you get these people, Rango Bapuji, you have Vakil of His Highness Shahu Maharaj Raja Satara, who was exiled in Benares. So he was there in England for about 14 or 15 years, and around them there was a Maratha group, but other people would come and know that that's a place you could hang out. And so there's those. And sometimes the missions were quite large. So the last major mission had about 50 people in it. And it was, again, Fazil Ali Shah, the last ruler of Oghuz, was deposed. He was imprisoned in Calcutta, but he sent his mother, a brother, and about 100 other people from Oghuz to London to get justice for him. And so that they arrive and they take over a whole hotel, and lots of other people are surrounding it and sort of looking at it. They get to London, they take over a couple of aristocrats' houses, and so for a substantial amount of time, this very large embassy, including the Queen Mother and the brother, were in London. They were in the presence. We know that in their basement of the houses where they were, that there were Lascars who came because there were a couple of English people who were very interested in this, and they went and they saw that they were having food together and eating together, so hanging out, having discussions and so on. So this was a center funded by, look now, by Oghuz, where people would congregate for a time. The difficulty here is they arrive in 1856. In 1857, suddenly it's not very popular to be an Indian. So they write about, suddenly people aren't looking to us as these attractive, exotic people. They look at as potential murderers, mutineers. And so this delegation actually promises if the English would give an army to Fazil Ali Shah, he would reconquer North India for the British. Now clearly the British weren't going to give him an army, but there's this idea of how do you prove you're loyal when you're in London, very dependent. And after 1857, the mission fell apart. They started suing each other. They went their various directions. And only about half of them ended up going home. So it was, for a time, a focal point, just as individual houses were in a microcosm, and the whole East, not the whole, but a substantial part of East London, you have 2,000 or 3,000 sailors at a time in a port. That's a presence. And they have certain demands, and there are people who help them out, and so that's where you have this early community.
Do we have time, or
One
should we
brief
wrap
last
up?
question, maybe.
One brief question. The first hand I saw was up there.
We can chat it.
Last one.
I'll put it very quickly and very briefly. In context of Harris's question, I was also wondering in what ways was race and racial features a constitutive marker of communitarian identification, because a lot of your references are also visual references, and they're very, they come from very visual understanding and reception of your body, of your racial features. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on in what ways was also race an important element of this group of people who were otherwise coming from very diverse and probably very discrete backgrounds.
An excellent question about which many, many books could and have been written. In short, because we don't have that much time, it changes over time. So in the 18th century, 1780s, 1790s, as people come to arrive, the notion of race that many British people had was based on your behavior, your clothing, not hereditary, not so much skin color. So for women in particular, they could assimilate by becoming married to a European, wearing European clothes, speaking English. Similarly for a lot of men, if they would just even nominally become Christian, wear European, they were largely brought in. And class was much more important, so that if you were from a higher class family, you were seen as moving among the aristocrats, whereas in a lower class family, you were seen as moving in that circle. And just one brief anecdote, this Abu Talib Khan, he went via South Africa. You think South Africa, race, clearly very important. He was there at around 1800, 1799. Race was very different, and he was actually celebrated in South Africa in the white community to the extent that he came out once in this soiree with a white woman on each arm saying, "1 night, 2 days." Right? So he's making fun of, or so it wasn't, and he hung out with the Duchess of Devonshire, who hung out with lots of people, so she was not very discriminating. But the point is, that was that over time it becomes different, and to oversimplify exactly, Darwin, notions of hereditary race, late 19th century, what you're born in, you can't change, right? And this was sparked by 1857, when suddenly race meant whether you were die or not. In India, the Jamaica uprising, 1865, the Maori Wars, and so by the late 19th century, race becomes much more fixed. And to some extent, Africans, Indians, they're all sort of black together. And that gives them a central movement. So in the early 20th century, the middle 20th century, you have these black movements, black identity in Britain, where Caribbean, African, Indian, Chinese, they're coming together because they're having this common experience in Britain of prejudice against them. But if you go back to the earlier times, it was much more diffuse by gender, by class, and it didn't so much matter about skin color or heredity. It was much more behavior, mannerisms, speech, and there was great debate in the East India Company, great in the sense of extensive, around 1790, 1800. How can we tell an Indian? What are the definitions of an Indian? And they decided, was it education? Was it language? Was it dressed in mannerisms? Because if you were Indian, the East India Company had to give you free room and board and passage home. So you get people who speak Portuguese from Brazil arriving and saying, I'm Indian too. I want the free housing. And the East India Company was paying for this, was trying to know, how do we know an Indian? And there's great debates. They couldn't decide what an Indian was. Until about 1830, somebody says, I know an Indian when I see one, right? So that became the definition. But they couldn't come up with an objective definition, and they tried because there were financial implications. So it changes over time, changes by gender, and it gets ever more difficult to be not Indian in London by the 19th, 20th century.
Thank you very much. And if you have questions for Michael, I'm sorry that I missed you. Why don't you come up and speak to Michael directly now, but we do have to stop. But thank you very much, Michael, for your interesting talk.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this wonderful talk, and Gil for engaging him and the audience. Thank you very much for your time and engagement. And I'll just make this announcement. We have our next LILA Prism lecture on environment by the editor of Down to Earth magazine, Richard Mahapatra, on October 8th. And we are also launching our film swing, LILA Lumières, on October 15th at IHC, Gulmohar, with a film called Salma, which is about a Tamil poet, Salma, who is also an activist and politician. So it's a documentary on her. She was barred from going to school at the age of 13, house arrested for almost 20 years, then got out and became one of the most well-known poets in South India. So I welcome all of you to these two lectures, and the other lectures are all on the schedule. Please be with us for all our programs. Thank you very much, and thank you for being a wonderful audience.